Hi, everybody, and welcome to the American Library in Paris. I am Rachel Donadio. I'm the Curator of Cultural Programs here, and it is a pleasure to welcome Michael Pollan to the library this evening. Just a show of hands, how many of you have been to the library before? All right. How many of you are members? Excellent. I want to ask how many of you have done psychedelic drugs. It's a safe space, and we'll keep that. You can, that's between you and your mind. I want to offer a very special thanks to Residence Tallard tonight for making this event possible, for bringing Michael to Paris. Residence Tallard is a program by the Cadist dedicated to hosting individuals from around the world who are recognized for their innovative ideas and impactful contributions to society. The format for this evening's conversation, Michael and I will speak for about 45 minutes. Mostly Michael will speak, and then we will open it up to questions from you in the audience. Michael Pollan is the author of 9 books, including This Is Your Mind on Plants, How to Change Your Mind, Cooked, Food Rules, In Defense of Food, The Omnivore's Dilemma, and The Botany of Desire, all of which were New York Times bestsellers. He is also the author of the audiobook Caffeine, How Coffee and Tea Made the Modern World. He is a longtime contributor to the New York Times Magazine, and he teaches writing at Harvard University and the University of California, Berkeley. In 2010, Time Magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. So let's have a big round of applause for Michael.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel. And thanks to the library for hosting this event.
It's great to have you here. As long as we've done a brief tour through all of your books, I want to just open by asking you, you've talked about your work as an investigation of the places where the human and natural worlds intersect, on our plates, in our gardens, in our minds. And I wonder if you could just walk us through a little bit. You've gone from plants to food, to psychedelic drugs, and now a forthcoming book about consciousness. How do we get from step 1 to whatever step we're at now?
Well, I trace all my work back to my first book, or the experiences that led to my first book, and that was Second Nature, which came out a very long time ago, I think 1992. And that book grew out of my experience with my wife Judith making a garden in a house we had bought in northwest Connecticut, a very rural part of Connecticut. And I realized in the course of working in the garden and making it that gardening is a really interesting place to examine our relationship to the natural world. And it's not where American writers normally go. American writers go to, they follow Thoreau. They go to nature. They go to the wilderness. But in the wilderness, you're just a spectator, really. You can have a lot of thoughts. Okay, great. But you don't have to engage. You don't have to behave. And because as soon as you start gardening, you have enemies in nature. You have weeds. You have pests. And you have to figure out what the ethics. There's an ethical issue. So anyway, I wrote this book about what we can learn about who we are and in the environmental predicament in the garden, and that everything is there. I got interested in plants. And then I got interested in how plants manipulate us, and that's what Botany of Desire was. Well, just by way of background, I recently had to reread Second Nature, which authors never do. You never reread your books. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And but I was doing an audiobook because it came out before there were audiobooks, so I had to read the whole thing. And I came home and I said to Judith one day, I says, God, I have not had a new idea since 1992. Because everything was there in germ form, including changing of consciousness and agriculture. And so one thing leads to another. And I got very interested in plants and our relationship to plants and how they manipulate us as their evolutionary strategy. They do this by gratifying our desires. These are domesticated plants. And those desires include obvious things like our desire for food, and our desire for beauty. But then there's this really interesting desire they gratify, which is the most mysterious of all, which is the desire to change consciousness. And plants have evolved these chemical compounds that just so happen to be keys that unlock big things in our brains. and it could be the memories unlocked by the scent of rosemary, but it's also what cannabis does to you, and it's what psychedelics do to you. And so what was that about? And how did that chemistry work? And so that brought me, after I'd written about agriculture and the food system and nutrition, that made me very curious about that. And then I learned about this research into psychedelics from an article in the New York Times, where most article ideas come from, that they were giving high-dose psilocybin at NYU and Johns Hopkins to people with terminal cancer diagnoses, and they were losing their fear of death. And I was like, how could that be? And that started the journey that led to How to Change Your Mind.
And I think if you will guide us on the guided journey through the book about some of the guided journeys, you cite R.D. Laing in the book, who once said that there are three things human beings are afraid of: death, other people, and their own minds. And you talk a little bit about why you wanted to try this experience: to give my own snow globe a vigorous shaking, see if I could renovate my everyday mental life by introducing a greater measure of entropy and uncertainty into it. What led you to this journey, and what benefits do you think you found for it and others that you cite in the book also found in it? Tell us a little bit about all that.
The first thing I wrote about psychedelics was a piece for the New Yorker called "The Trip Treatment" in 2014, and that it was a typical New Yorker piece in that there was very little first person, and I mean especially typical then, a little less typical now, and it was very objective journalism. And but when I decided to write a book about it, because I had just kind of scratched the surface. There are two kinds of articles you write. One is you finish it, you're like, I am so sick of that topic, I don't want to go near it ever again. And the other is, gee, there's so much here. I really want to write a book about it. So that happened. But I also knew that my readers would be very frustrated if I wrote a whole book on psychedelics without tripping. And the reason is that that's been a kind of the way I've proceeded. When I wrote about the cattle industry, I bought a cow and followed it through the process. When I wrote about architecture, I built a little house. And I really like putting myself in the book and have... for reasons having to do with a lack of narrative imagination on my part. I'm not a natural born storyteller, so I have to confect a story sometimes in my books, and it's usually growing genetically modified potatoes or whatever. And I like doing that. I like finding a first person hook because it gives you humor. It gives you, when you do something for the first time, you can write about it with a sense of wonder that people who've done it for years and years and years will never recover again. So I like putting myself in that. So I had some other reasons, but I was terrified to do psychedelics. I agreed with R.D. Laing that your own mind is a dangerous place to explore. And you don't know what's going to come up. I mean, it's the huge question mark over any psychedelic experience is, what am I going to learn about myself? Am I going to surface some childhood trauma? People often do. How am I going to deal with that if that happens? So I approached it with a lot of trepidation. I went around and I had to go to the underground to do this because the kinds of university trials I was describing in my writing about it, they wouldn't have me. I didn't fit the bill of who they were looking for, and I don't know that they would have had a journalist participate anyway. So I found my way into the underground, and I started interviewing people, and some of them, were not very good. I remember interviewing this one guy who had done so much of this. He was Israeli, and he had been guiding people forever, and I would ask him questions about, what do you do if something goes wrong? And he would kind of shrug and like, what if someone dies during one of these? Are you going to call 911? What are you going to do? Because they're underground. They can't. They don't want the police coming. And I said, so what do you do if someone dies during a trip? And he says, bury him with all the other people. It's like, well, that didn't reassure me. So I moved on to somebody else, and I finally found somebody who I just kind of connected with, even though she was very kind of woo-woo, and she was going to like wave crow feathers over my head and have incense burning and all that, which I'm normally allergic to, but for some reason she did it with such conviction that she seemed okay. So I proceeded to have an experience with her, which was interesting beyond my wildest dreams. I can tell you a little more about it, but it didn't.
Do tell us.
It wasn't all great. I had this idea that I wanted to conduct a scientific experiment during my trip, and I had heard that it's going to take a little while. Predictive coding is a theory of how the brain works. That's pretty widely accepted in perception research, consciousness research. The idea being that what we perceive is like 90% prediction, and our senses are not constructing a picture of the world at any moment. They're essentially correcting a projection we're making. That we assume that a room like this, with people like this, looks like this, and then we fill in the details. And there's a famous experiment that demonstrates this. It's called the rotating mask, and if you go online and search, you'll find it. And it's a picture of a mask, like the ones in the happy and sad theater, thing. And as it turns, you see a face that's convex, like most faces you've seen, and it turns. And when you get to the back of the face, where you're seeing the concave face, it pops out and becomes convex again, because your brain insists that faces can't be concave. This is universal. Anyone does this will get the same reaction, except if you're schizophrenic or you're tripping. And I wanted to see if this was true. I had been told this by a researcher in Germany. And so I was going to test it on myself. So I brought in my laptop, and I had the whole thing queued up. And my guide is like, you really don't want a laptop for your trip. But I said, no, I just want to try this thing, and then I'll put it aside. So I tried it after I was sort of, there's an arc to the experience. And on the way up, I tried it, and it didn't work. And then sometime after the peak of the experience, which was very intense, I tried it again, and I looked at the screen, and the whole image just melted. It didn't work. Anyway, in the course of this trip, a couple interesting things happened, but the most important and the most lasting was there was a moment, at a certain point, my guide said, do you want more? Do you want a booster? And I was in for a dime, in for a dollar, so I said, sure. And she gave me another mushroom to eat. And but when I turned to her, so she's blonde and very Nordic looking, with her hair parted in the middle, and she was going to offer me this thing, and she's kneeling next to the futon that I'm lying on, and she's been transformed, and she's got black hair and leathery dark skin, and she's been transformed into someone I well knew who she was, Maria Sabina, who was the curandera in Mexico, who gave the first white person to rediscover psilocybin in 1956, and I've been researching this person. I knew who it was. She's a legendary figure in the psychedelic world, because the transition from indigenous psychedelics to Western psychedelics happens in that transaction. And suddenly, Mary, my guide, had turned into Maria Sabina. I didn't know whether I should tell her, but in the end, she was flattered. And anyway, so after that, I took this booster, and then I had this moment where I saw myself, and the pronouns are going to be a little screwed up here as happens. I saw myself explode into a cloud of blue Post-it notes. And blue is like my favorite color. I wear a lot of blue clothing, so I wasn't surprised they were blue. And then they fluttered to the ground like snowflakes or leaves, and they coalesced in a pool of blue paint. And that was me. I looked, and that was me. Now, I looked who's the I that was looking? It wasn't me. It was some new, perfectly objective perspective that was sort of the view from nowhere. It wasn't it wasn't a subjective perspective. And there I was. And it was absolutely fine to have been dissolved into blue paint. I had no problem with it. It seemed right. And I wasn't happy, but I wasn't sad. It was perfectly fine. And then the guide, so there's music. I didn't describe that much about the setting, but there's, in a guided trip, you're wearing headphones, and they're playing a playlist that's been very carefully curated, and you're wearing an eye mask. And the reason for that, for both things, is to send you inward, to have a very interior journey rather than sort of grooving on the woods or the beach or whatever, or the concert. So that's a very important element. And she put on a Bach. We had a lot of arguments about music. You can imagine her taste in music from the crow's wings and everything. And she was playing this music that was really irritating me. It was like, it would have been fine for a massage and like a nice spa, but for a mental journey of great profundity, it was all wrong. So I had asked her to put on this piece of Bach unaccompanied cello suite number 2 in D minor, which is a very sad piece of music that I'd heard at funerals. And I had the most profound experience of music I'd ever had. Because when you don't have an ego anymore, and for this period of time I had no ego whatsoever, there's no wall between you and the world. And that's why people have this sense of merging, and it could be with the divinity, it could be with nature, it could be with people in your life. It happened to be, for me, this piece of music, and I became identical to this piece of music, which is hard to explain, but there was no subject-object experience. I was just it. And it was incredibly beautiful and ecstatic in the literal sense of outside of, self-transcendence. So that was the high point for me, and then there's this long denouement after that. And it was a very interesting study of what the ego is, and to survive the loss of your ego it tells you that you and your ego are not identical, and that's very important information. And it gives you a little bit of perspective on that voice in your head, that critical voice, or that is doing so much to drive you forward in one way or another. And egos are great and very important, and they get books written and all sorts of stuff, but they're also dictatorial and the cause of a great deal of suffering. And so to have that dissociation from your ego and realize there are other voices you can listen to in your head, and you don't always have to listen to that one, was an important lesson that I took away. So, very long answer to your question, but there it is.
You're a great guide to this. And to those of you who haven't read the book, it really is Michael's experience walking us through this, but also through the history and the science and many clinical studies. So maybe tell us a little bit about some of the clinical studies that you talk about in the book, and what conditions, whether it's anxiety or depression or addiction, that some of these drugs have been found to be helpful for.
Sure. Well, the first thing to know, and this was a big surprise to me, is that the scientific study of psychedelics is not a new thing. And that there was a period beginning in the 50s, late 40s, 50s, well into the 60s, where LSD in particular, and psilocybin to a lesser extent, were heavily studied by scientists. There were 120 peer-reviewed studies of LSD between 1950 and 1965, 40,000 research subjects, people had been dosed, 6 international conferences on LSD alone. So this was considered a really big development in psychiatry and mental health treatment. And it gets shut down with the drug war. Nixon comes along in 1970. He comes along before that, but in 1970 he decides he's going to make all these substances illegal. And it had nothing to do with public health. It was subsequently revealed that it was purely political. He wanted to disrupt 2 communities. as his two enemies. He called them the blacks and the hippies. And banning LSD would help him disrupt the hippie community, and banning cannabis would help him disrupt both communities. And so we lost 30 years of research because that period was finding some really interesting results. They were getting about 50% success rate treating alcoholism with LSD. And keep that in mind, because there are researchers in Paris right now who are prepared to study LSD in the treatment of alcoholism, which is a tremendous problem here. So in a way, it is a renaissance of research. The first study I looked at was giving psychedelics to people with terminal cancer diagnosis, or what the doctors call existential distress over the prospect of dying or the fear of recurrence. And they got remarkable results in about, I think it was 2/3 of the cases. And I interviewed these people, and they had experiences that completely reset their understanding of their death and led to acceptance in many cases. That was very moving to read about. They went on from there. That was a very strategically chosen first target because it's very hard to deny something, a drug like this, an experience like this, to people who are already dying. They've gone on to look at depression, anxiety, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. There's a trial underway now for eating disorders, which is actually the hardest of all mental illnesses to treat and has the highest mortality. And addictions of various kinds. Alcohol, cigarettes, and cocaine, I know, have all been. Now, you might think, and I thought, what kind of panacea is this? I mean, one drug working for all these different things. And I put this question to a man named Tom Insel, who is a very well-known psychiatrist. He was head of the National Institute of Mental Health. He'd already stepped down when I interviewed him about this. And he said, well, why do you assume all those conditions are different? And what he meant was they may all be products of a brain that is just too rigid in its patterns, that people get stuck in loops of rumination. And that can manifest in different ways. And one is addiction, which is, obsessive behavior of one kind, and then there is obsessive thought of another kind. And depression also, people get into loops of rumination. Anxiety, and that's often about the past. Anxiety is loops of rumination about the future. So he was saying we may discover at some point that what we think of as disorders are actually symptoms of something deeper. And it may be that psychedelics address, because they are very good at helping you break patterns and acquire new perspectives, and essentially rewrite the story you tell yourself, or that your ego is telling yourself over and over again, that I'm unworthy of love, or I can't get through the day without a cigarette. And people emerge from these experiences with insights, and that allows them to actually change. There's a quality to the insights you have on psychedelics. And William James wrote about this. He called it the noetic quality, where what you felt, what you observed, is not just an opinion or an insight. It's revealed truth. It has an incredible weight. And I talked to people who were in a smoking cessation study, and they would tell me about they had this trip, and they were flying all over the world, and they came to Rome, ancient Rome, and then they came to this civilization, and visited here and there, and realized, God, there's so much wonderful things to experience in the world, and it's so stupid to smoke cigarettes. Now, not a profound insight. They probably had that thought before, but now it was like etched in stone, and it was so meaningful to them that they could actually change their behavior on the basis of that. So it seems really implausible, but that appears to be how it works. Now, at the molecular level, we're still figuring out what's going on. But one of the interesting findings that I talk about in the book is which brain network is affected by psychedelics. And it appears that there's something called the default mode network in your brain, which connects the cortex to the amygdala and centers of memory and emotion. It's called the default mode network because if you have no task, it's the part that pops up, and when you're daydreaming. They discovered it when they put people in fMRIs and they wanted a base condition. They said, don't think about anything. The default mode network would pop up. The default mode network is also where your sense of self is located. So there is a structure in it, the posterior cingulate cortex, where the narrative of your life is constructed. And that's where you take what happens to you and plug it into the story that I'm this kind of person and that this kind of thing happens to. And so the default mode network is deactivated during psychedelic experience, which is really interesting because people think that there's all this fireworks, so there must be all this activity. But this part of your brain, which is really an orchestrator of the whole brain, goes offline. And they've correlated the degree to which that happens to the sense of ego dissolution. So basically, you're short-circuiting the ego-generating, story-generating part of your brain, and that may allow you to revise those stories. So that's still somewhat hypothetical, but there's some good evidence for that.
It's really fascinating. In the book, you also talk about the mystical experience questionnaire that's given to some of the people in some of these studies. And you've also said that you have an upcoming piece in the New Yorker about a different study on psychedelics. I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. The mystical experience questionnaire has been a standard thing they give people in psychedelic trips. It's controversial now, but the idea is it's based on William James, who's influenced this field. William James founded American psychology, but now is regarded as a philosopher because he didn't do experiments, but he's a brilliant psychologist. And he wrote a lot about mystical experience and the varieties of religious experience. And he didn't see them as specifically religious. He said they could have any content at all, but he characterized them. And they have these qualities, which includes merging with something larger than yourself, this transcendence of the sense of self, transcendence of sense of time and space, feeling of well-being. He had like 8 or 9 qualities to this. And the researchers who were doing early psychedelic research realized that this well characterized the psychedelic experience. So this questionnaire you have to fill it out after you have one of these experiences. And about 2/3 of people have a mystical experience on it. Anyway, given this interest in mysticism, a group of researchers at NYU and Johns Hopkins, the same groups that did that early study of cancer, anxiety, came up with this kind of wacky idea, which is we're going to offer a high dose of psilocybin to ministers, priests, rabbis, imams, Buddhist monks, any religious professional we can get to play. And they worked very hard to recruit across the board, and not just Western religions. They had trouble landing a Muslim. They finally got one. They never found a Hindu. The rabbis were lining up. They had to disqualify a lot of them because one of the criteria for the study was you had to be psychedelically naive, and a lot of these rabbis had tripped before. The other group, though, that's overrepresented, and you can tell me why, I don't know, is Episcopalians. They were all over it, too. Anyway, so I interviewed, probably a dozen of the people in this study, and their experiences were really interesting. I mean, why they did it exactly, they never really articulated it that well, but they thought they might have nuanced understanding of the experience. They were interested to know how authentic they thought this experience was. I mean, assuming they were experts on spiritual experience, which actually many people in religion are not. Many people, I was surprised. I'd never interviewed a lot of religious professionals, but some of them have never had a spiritual experience at all. They're there for kind of social reasons and traditional reasons. Well, that's okay. And many of them had their first mystical experience on this drug. they thought it was authentic, most of them. They thought it was no different than what the great mystics in history had experienced and reported. All but one, I think I have my facts right, said that they had had a divine encounter. And I talked to them a lot about what that looked like. None of them saw God as a figure or a bearded man or anything like that. But they felt a presence, like if they turned around, God was right behind them. The Muslims said that. But what was interesting about these divine encounters is that among men and women, the divine was feminine. And that blew some of their minds. There was one, a Baptist said that God was a lot like a Jewish mother. And she was kind of surprised. She said, I'm a Jesus follower. I don't know what that meant. Nobody saw the God or experienced the God of the Old Testament. It was interesting. It was a much gentler figure. So they were fascinating to talk to. I'd never interviewed people like this. A couple of the interesting things that came out of it is 3 of them had big career changes, and in some cases left their ministry to start organizations to bring psychedelics into their faith. They saw it as a way to lead to a spiritual revival, and that may prove very controversial when the piece comes out. That's going to bother some people, I think. Yeah, so we'll see. But that piece comes out on May 19th.
Great. Thank you for the sneak preview. This brings me to a question. In your work, you're such a terrific journalist and storyteller, even if you say you're not. And you also have taken your work to a next step. So it's not just how does agricultural farming work, it then becomes eat food, not too much, mostly plants. You shift from an observational journalistic mode to a kind of how can I help and how can I heal and how can the world be made better because of this? And I wonder, tell us a little bit about your thinking about that. Was there just a day when you said, actually, I'm just done observing, I need to move to another phase?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's a tricky question because, if you write about the same thing for a while, you become an expert. And I much prefer the phase before I'm an expert. I love being the idiot who's just learning and is curious. And if you read most of my articles and books, I am an idiot on page 1. I haven't figured things out. I have a bunch of questions. And the story I usually confect is the quest to answer some very simple questions, like what should I eat? But there is a point where it would be disingenuous for you to pretend you hadn't drawn any conclusions after all this work, and yet some journalists continue to pretend that way. And I've always found that kind of, false. So at a certain point where I do think I've figured out what you should eat, that I tell you. And so there's this arc from investigation to advocacy. And certainly in food, I ended up an advocate and doing things to, not with much success, but trying to change the food system. And I had a very clear sense which direction it should go in. And I was very fortunate that I was writing for the New York Times Magazine at a certain point in history where they had this forum called the Reported Essay, where you could go out and do a lot of reporting, and yet you could draw conclusions. And so I sort of came of age as a journalist under that. But that's one of the reasons I changed subjects, too, because I like putting myself back in that learning mode. I mean, what I love about journalism is, like, we get paid as adults to educate ourselves, to learn all about neuroscience or, the food system and soil science and all this kind of stuff. And so I don't like writing as an expert, because then you end up on the op-ed page, for $250.
Alas, we'll talk about the business model of journalism later. One thing that struck me in reading How to Change Your Mind, and in some of the things that you just said a little bit before this about the drug wars and Nixon, and you've also called the drug war, some of it the war on certain plants. But we're in this moment now where it seems that the line between culture and counterculture and establishment and insurgency has been completely scrambled. And I wonder how that affects your own thinking, I guess, about psychedelic drugs and their normalization potentially, but also just in general about science.
Well, it's really uncomfortable when you find yourself agreeing with RFK Jr. about anything. But in fact, yes, the lines have really gotten messy, and he's definitely a product of that, or a cause of that. I'm not sure which. Well, the case of psychedelics is interesting. This was a very left-wing cultural phenomenon in the '60s, without doubt. It fueled the counterculture, the anti-war movement, and conservatives disdain psychedelics. Now it's very different, and because psychedelics are being used to treat veterans, they have a lot of support on the right in Congress, and Rick Perry is a big supporter of psychedelic medicine for vets, and the VA is starting to embrace it. If there's anyone left at the VA, they may do some interesting research. And in the government, you have RFK Jr., you have Elon Musk, and assorted others I forget the name of the guy who's running the FDA, but who've made very positive statements about psychedelics. So they actually may get approved under this administration, which I think is a mixed blessing because they're going to try to short circuit the normal FDA process. And if psychedelics gets approved on that basis, I think it'll have an asterisk over it forever, which would really be unfortunate. I mean, I think they should just go through the proper channels and do it the normal way. But yeah, psychedelics, there's a whole right-wing embrace of psychedelics right now. And I don't know how I feel about it, but it's very interesting to watch.
And it's also at a time when there's a war on expertise in general and on dismantling regulatory systems. And
well, that's
science.
why they feel they can push it through. They feel like, screw the science. We want this. And I think that's a tremendous mistake.
And there's also this moment of, some people are preparing for life on Mars. And so much of your work has been about land and soil and the earth we live on and also our own.
Well, this whole, we have an environmental crisis. So you can imagine that transcending nature would be very high in the minds of powerful people right now. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, both of whom think our future is in space. I don't know if you've read any of what they've said, but Elon Musk thinks we have to bring X million people to Mars. Mars is not habitable. The soil is so poisonous that you would have to live underground. And he's planning to have people live underground on Mars. There's so much radiation, you can't walk around on the surface of Mars. I mean, it's so insane. And Bezos wants to put people in space stations, maybe because he's read about the poisonous soil, or maybe because that's going to be Elon Musk's place. These are all ways to distract us from dealing with what's in front of us, which is an environmental crisis. And the tech people have believed for a long time they can transcend nature. There's a wonderful show at the Jeu de Paume about AI right now that I encourage you to see. And on the first floor, it's on 2 floors, they do a brilliant job recontextualizing AI as a product. As a product, we're getting off of addiction now. As a manifestation of nature. That AI depends on vast quantities of energy. It depends on rare earths and all sorts of physical things. And they've convinced us this is all taking place in the cloud. Isn't it beautiful? We've digitized things so we don't have to mess with the world. But it's another industry that's going to consume huge amounts of resources. Anyway, it's a very interesting show for that reason and others. So all my work is about nature, and I'm always trying to put show, because we live so abstracted from the natural world. I mean, a lot of what I do wouldn't be necessary 100 years ago. You wouldn't need an investigative journalist to tell you like where your food comes from. Everybody knew where their food came from. They were either farmers, or they knew farmers, or they went to farms. And now you need an investigative journalist to tell you this simple information. So yeah, everything I do in the end is about like trying to reroute things, and in the work on consciousness too. I'm trying to show, because there's a whole conversation that we're going to have AI consciousness. It's just around the corner. I mean, there's AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is intelligence and consciousness are not the same thing. They're kind of orthogonal. But there is a move to make conscious AIs, and I think it's crazy. I mean, not because it's dangerous. It may or may not be dangerous, but I just see consciousness as a product of bodies and mortality and feeling, and they don't. They see it as a computation, and so this desire to transcend our mortal flesh and the world we're wrecking is very powerful, and it's an attractive ideology because we're all looking for an escape hatch.
You've said about your own work and in general that sometimes there's one question that animates a writer or a creative person's work that they're grappling with for their whole life. And I wonder how you found your question and what advice you would give to some of us who might not actually know what our question is.
Yeah, I didn't know what mine was. So the term, which is, I think comes from Richard Rorty, the American philosopher, is that we all have our final questions. And this very much applies to writers. And that, if you think about writers you like, if you scratch down to the core, you'll often find them returning to the same themes. And they're big themes. It might be love, and it might be eros, it might be money or power or success. I discovered during the writing of my second book what my questions were. And the reason was, my second book is about architecture. And I thought I'd written a book about gardens and nature, and now I was just going to move. I was done with nature, and I was going to we were renovating a house. I got very interested in the architectural and the building process, and I had left that. And I found the issues in architecture that most engaged me were the nature issues, like how does the human body dictate what we build and what we can build? There was a movement at the time when I was writing this book toward a pure architecture based on literary theory, and that like a poem, a building could be anything. And I was wondering, well, is that really true? How does that feel to a body of a certain type in a certain space? I got very interested in where the wood came from and following that, and the materiality of it. And architecture is not like literature. It can't be arbitrary. And it is rooted in nature in certain ways, even though there's a huge amount of flexibility as to what you can do. So I was like, okay, am I repeating myself? Or maybe this is just what I care about. And finally, I couldn't accept that I was repeating myself. So I voted for door 2. And I realized then that, okay, I'm going to probably keep coming back to these issues of the human engagement with nature, which I know is a strange phrase because it implies we're not in nature, but we have a very unusual relationship to nature. We have a relationship to nature. Nothing else does. That these were my final questions. And I see it coming up in work in very different ways. But it's a process for the young writer to figure it out. And it doesn't usually happen in the first book. And it's one of the reasons second books are much harder than first books. Because that's when you're finding your identity as a writer and what's going to abide versus I was just learning about this and wrote about this.
Michael, thank you so much. We're going to open it up to questions from you in the room. I ask you to keep your questions fairly succinct and remind you that a question is something to which you don't already know the answer.
Who has a question?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much. My question is about a person that you mentioned in your book a lot, a surprising amount, and you mentioned his name tonight as well, William James. I guess, I was surprised to read in your book, William James is more involved in the history of psychedelics than I thought. Just one example, he cited when, I think, Dr. Leary is defending himself in Harvard, or his approach to taking drugs with his grad students as part of his experimental method. He just surprisingly cited a lot, and I think you talk about that. Well, I was just curious, from your personal perspective, did you have a pre-existing personal affinity for William James and his approach and his writing, his perspective? As the moderator mentioned, you do have an experiential approach to the subjects you write about, and that's kind of
yeah, and I think that's key to him. So I haven't read a lot of James. He's actually very hard to read. He's brilliant and he's boring, and his sentences are like as long as Proust's. I mean, they're really, really long, but he's brilliant and he's a kind of phenomenologist. I mean, he's very interested, and this is why he's been kind of kicked out of science, unfairly, I think, because he likes to, he describes experience in the most granular way. There's a passage in his lecture or article on the stream of consciousness, which I read very closely. It's a wonderful essay, where he's describing the phenomenon of not being able to find a word. And we all know exactly this, right? You forget a word. And he starts describing it with a level of detail that is so beautiful. And he says it's an absence, but it's a very particular kind of absence, because if someone proposes the word, you very well know it's not right. And so it's a pregnant absence, and he goes into just wonderful detail on drawing that feeling and the at the tip of your tongue, and what is that about? So I like him for that reason. He's more descriptive than analytical, and he doesn't offer any theories for this. He's just saying, how marvelous and how weird. He was very interested in psychoactives, and he experimented with nitrous oxide, laughing gas, and wrote about his experiences. And there's some people who think he also experimented with peyote or tried to and got very sick. But he was very interested in altered states of consciousness, including mystical experience. So he was important in that book, and he's important in this book too, the consciousness book.
Another question?
There's one there.
Yeah.
And then in the back.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Oh, yes. So I'm assuming that when you took psilocybin, you're talking about plant hallucinogenics. What is the
fungus.
difference?
Yeah, it's a mushroom, but
okay.
yes.
I'm an old hippie. I've been there. But what is the difference between LSD and psilocybin?
Good question. LSD was made in the lab, even though it's derived from a fungus called ergot, which contaminates grain, rye in particular, and it may have led to the Salem witch trials and other episodes of witch outbreaks. But it's not a safe drug by itself. It also gives you gangrene as a side effect, pretty serious. So that's one. One is synthetic, and the other is naturally occurring. They operate on the same receptor networks, the serotonin 2A receptors. The LSD molecule locks into the receptor more tightly, so it lasts longer, and the experience lasts longer. It's like 8 to 10 hours for LSD, where it's 4 to 6 hours for psilocybin. And that's one of the reasons they use psilocybin in the studies, because otherwise you'd be paying a lot of overtime to your therapist. No, I mean, it's very hard to fit into a day at work if you're giving people LSD. And they'll be dealing with that here when they start doing it, I think. And the other reason that they lean towards psilocybin is LSD is just more radioactive politically and culturally, and a lot of people don't know what psilocybin is. A lot of people who might object don't know what psilocybin is. But the effects are very similar.
Someone else? Emma?
Hi, thanks so much for being here. It's really a pleasure to hear you speak.
Thank you.
Myself, like probably lots of people in this room, are American but live here. And we've been watching what's been going on for the last 4 months now. And I want to know how you feel about all of this as a well-respected journalist, specifically in regards to the state of journalism and where it may be going in the next 3.5 years.
Here we are. Well, you know, Trump has attacked many institutions, a couple that I'm involved with, including Harvard, and he's also attacked journalism. And there is not a journalist I know who isn't alarmed and distressed by this. It's taught us something about journalism, and it's taught us about the importance of independent journalism. That the journalistic organizations that are owned by large corporations are particularly vulnerable. I mean, we say that with Paramount and with Disney, Paramount owning CBS and Disney owning ABC, that when Trump started, filing these really bullshit suits, they caved. Why? Because they had more important business before the government, mergers in the case of Paramount. And 60 Minutes represents nothing. It's just, they don't have any sort of conviction about it. It's just another one of their many things. So it's a really important reminder on the dangers of corporate concentration. And that when these kind of companies own media outlets. But, okay, what's the alternative? Well, media outlets owned by billionaires. How's that going? Well, in some ways good, in some ways bad. I mean, we've seen at the Washington Post when Bezos decided, who had built the Post into a great newspaper, again, and invested heavily in it and gave the Times the competition it needs for a period of time. When he decided to pivot to sucking up to Trump, they killed their endorsement of Kamala Harris and ended up pushing out their op-ed editor and have declared he's only going to publish op-ed pieces that are about free markets and personal liberty. That's going to be really fun to read. So, on the other hand, you have The Atlantic that Laurene Powell Jobs has bought and built up into a really formidable source. So what's the model that's going to work is really the question. You have a lot of journalists now on their own on Substack. What do they do when they get sued? They don't have any. They don't have resources. So it's a very parlous time for journalism, and for all of us who care about it, it's time to support independent journalism and subscribe and join those Substacks and pay those subscription fees. It's really important because the advertising model is you have two things happen at the same time, which is the advertising business model has collapsed because social media and search has taken all the advertising dollars. At the same time, so journalism is already weakened, and then you have this attack. It's the worst of all possible worlds. But the best thing we can do is support independent journalism.
Thank you. Excuse me. So your books, I'm looking at the titles are focused on the mind, but having been through this experience and having journeyed, and you talk about this mystical experience, what do you think as an observer and somebody who's experienced this about that connection, that mystical connection? I mean, you have all these religious, professionals who experience what they call God. And then you have, you said, so having been through it, what do you think is the connection there? Is there a,
connection between what and what?
Between the psilocybin experience when you're and this sort of mystic
I see.
connection. I mean, I know you're talking about depression and the things that it does for your mind, but as an observer.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that the key thing that's happening is the softening or shrinking of the ego. And that there is this construct in our minds that is, the controller. And that controller, for all its value, and I'm sure it have adaptive value in evolution, also, like a lot of things, had a downside. And the downside was this, self-punishment. And so that I think anything that softens the ego can be positive. Experience of awe, for example. I have a colleague at Berkeley who studies awe, Dacher Keltner, and awe is a very interesting emotion. And it's a very pro-social emotion. People who have an awe experience, and this is one of the reasons people go to cathedrals, people who have an awe experience tend to be less egotistical and more connected to community. And he's done cool experiments where he asks you to draw a stick figure of a person, and then give you an awe experience, usually a video of some kind, and then you draw it again. And guess what? It'll be like half as big. So there's the shrinking of the ego in microcosm. So I think that's key. And my understanding of spirituality, which changed during these experiences, is that, to me, I used to think spirituality implied supernatural phenomenon, and I had no patience for it at all. But I came to see that spirituality really is about ego transcendence and this sense of connection that follows, that you're part of something larger. And there's a great comfort in that, but there's also a great social value because it tends to make you more interested and more compassionate toward community. So to me, I used to think the opposite of spiritual was material, and that. But now I think the opposite of spiritual is egotistical.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk, first of all. And secondly, I have a little problem with the word ego, but I love the way that when speaking about the brain and the chemical effects of the brain, that you sort of segued into the experience. In other words, my question is, do you know the work of Francisco Varela?
I do, yeah. Very
Awesome.
influenced by that. Yeah.
Awesome. Because for me, what you really do is you bring together, Francisco moved away from the systems analysis of the brain the computer as a metaphor for the brain. And after his invention of embodied cognitive cognition, embodied inactive cognition, neurophenomenology, to me, that's what you're speaking of. Mm-hmm. To me, ego has a little bit too much reference back to Freud, the superego, the way you describe it. But phenomenologically, I love what you're saying because you're really bringing them together. The old dual, non-dual mind-body conundrum.
Yeah, so Varela is a very interesting thinker, Chilean, I think, died prematurely. But Evan Thompson, the philosopher, has continued his work and had a big influence on me when I read it. There's a wonderful book called The Blind Spot that came out last year that Evan Thompson wrote with two physicists. And what they're looking at is, it's a critique of science, of Western science. Thank you, Gleiser. Marcello Gleiser. Anyway, it's a fascinating book, and it makes you realize that we've designed science, going back to Galileo, in a very specific way that makes it impossible to study consciousness. And that was on purpose, because Galileo, the church, they left consciousness and subjectivity to the church, and they said, we'll take what you can measure and be objective about. You guys can do that. And that was a way to keep from getting burnt at the stake. But we're stuck with that legacy now, and we have a science that has virtually no space for phenomenology, for direct experience. Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
One there. Sorry.
Oh, do we have to?
Okay, we're going to do 2 questions.
Quick one. You talk about the philosophical and medicinal uses of psychedelics. What do you think of using psychedelics as not entertainment, but as part of recreation? Thank you.
So the word recreation has a bad rap. And if you listen to it, like, why should it? I mean, recreational use of drugs, we disdain that. But recreation is a good thing. So as much as I talk about people using them in this therapeutic context, people have used them in a great many other contexts too. And some people have had wonderful experiences. Some people have had disastrous experiences. So I don't want to minimize that. There is also the religious use of psychedelics. There's the use of psychedelics as rites of passage in many cultures. You know, what we've been talking about really is the Western use of psychedelics since the 50s, but they go back thousands of years. They recently found peyote that was 6,000 years old in a locket kind of thing. And indigenous people have been using psychedelics for a very long time, and they use them for healing, divination, rites of passage, and as sacraments. When the conquistadors got here, there was a very active psilocybin culture, and they called it Teonantecatl, which meant flesh of the gods, which was very threatening to Christians, as you can imagine. That there was an alternative sacrament, and this one didn't require any faith. You could actually meet God, and so they crushed it. So there are many different contexts. We've been focused on one here, but there are many other contexts that are, I think, potentially just as valuable. Last question, right there. Wait,
Here,
microphone
hold on.
coming.
Yeah, microphone coming.
So, do you sense that the nature of ego has changed from the beginning of time to where it is now?
God, why did I say we needed one more question? Yes. I think we'll leave it there. Yes, I mean, everything's historical in one way or another, and I'm sure it's changed. And if you read literature, yes, Shakespeare contributes something to the ego, and Freud certainly contributed something to the ego. And at different times in history, yes, I think it's been very different. I don't think it's an eternal phenomenon. But thank you for a very hard question that I'll be thinking about for a long time.
Can we have a big round of applause?